Welcome to Navigating India. Indira Gandhi imposed the emergency in India from June 1975 to January 1977, a story many of us are already familiar with. Last year marked 50 years since the emergency was proclaimed, and there are already so many books on that period, popular histories, academic histories, examining it from every angle. Indira Gandhi's emergency is also back to the center of the Indian politics today. In 2024, Union government announced its decision to observe 25th June, the day emergency was proclaimed, as Samvidhan Hatya Divas, Murder of Constitution Day. This is in part to memorialize emergency in the public memory as a dark period of Indian history after independence. But one story that's been almost completely forgotten is that of the story of resistance mounted against Indira Gandhi's emergency by a group of largely unknown individuals in United States of America. Individuals with no affiliation to any political party, those who are not part of powerful political families, not part of trade unions or any ideological formations, who nonetheless built a vibrant resistance to increase international pressure on Indira Gandhi's government. These people are part of the small community of Indian diaspora who are less than a lakh in number in United States in 1970s, included people like Anand Kumar, Ravi Chopra, S.R. Hiremath, Shrikumar Poddar, and also joined by few Americans like Mavis Sigwalt, Paula Bronstein, and pacifist Horace Alexander. These individuals came together and formed an organization called Indians for Democracy, and they are the principal protagonists of the book The Conscience Network, a chronicle of resistance to a dictatorship, written by our guest today, a prominent journalist and author, Sugata Srinivasaraju. Sugata brings together for the first time a story of these amazing individuals and their resistance against emergency. The vision of these individuals was not to make any political gain, but a vision that reflected a deep concern for democracy, which they saw as crucial for realizing the goals of India's progress and development. They had an Indian dream, and their actions collectively show a constructive national spirit with an international embrace. Join me in this conversation with Sugata Srinivasaraju to know more. Sugata, welcome to the show. And I want to start this conversation by understanding what is your first encounter with emergency and how did you come to learn about it, understand what it means?
Okay, that's interesting because I hardly understood emergency. I was born in 71 November. So emergency happened 4 years later. But it was just, emergency was being spoken about at regular intervals, and more so in a very in the context of literature. It was not so much as a political kind of movement or protest or anything like that, but more in terms of protest literature. So, there were a lot of books in my father's library, which, creative literature, which were written during the emergency, but published after the emergency. And, I happened to read them. Then I also, was at a point of time consuming a lot of protest literature, including, one of my most favorite books is the Penguin Book of Socialist Verse, edited by Alan Bold. So, I was, when you were growing up, you were always scouting for ideas which you could use to sort of show your own creativity or start writing. I always wanted to write. I always read. And I came from a family which had that kind of an environment. So I picked up quite by accident this book, a very slim volume called Apatkalina Kavitegalu. It's a collection of poems which was edited by a very fine literary critic in Kannada called Kiram Nagraj. And it was a collection of poems published in 1977 after the emergency was lifted. And it was an anthology of protest poetry written during the emergency. In fact, if you look at my book a little closely, right at the beginning, you will see that I have translated a short passage from a poem of Chandrasekhar Patil, which is one of my favorites. In fact, all the poems in that anthology are, excellent. In fact, one of Shivrudrappa's poems, which I had translated long back, Ramchandra Guha, the historian, uses it in his India after Gandhi. He's acknowledged this thing and he's used it there, which is about I think about the Nehru Gandhi dynasty, and I vaguely remember the lines, but then I know it is for sure Shivrudrappa's poems. So that uh, was my early introduction to this whole thing. It was still a literary idea. It was not a political idea in my head. And then later, much later, I suddenly realized my father himself had written mime plays during the emergency. It was his way of protesting the curbing of free speech. There was a kind of a gag, which was operational at that time, which was huge, and people were being sent to jail for protesting and speaking against the regime. So my father had devised a very interesting method to express, and that was the mime plays. So I was a little hesitant to read my own father. There was a kind of inhibition inside to pick up your own father's book, and that too, a set of plays, which it did not interest me initially. But I loved the cover of that book. That was that was what always kept coming back to me. It was a cover designed by this great playwright and theater director Prasanna. Prasanna was with the National School of Drama. Then he was himself part of a lot of protest movements in Karnataka and Samudaya and all of that. So he had designed the cover for that book, and it was very innovative, and the letterings were innovative and interesting. So I was more drawn into the design of the cover initially, but then slowly mustered the courage to read it. In fact, I read it only after I got into journalism, that is after 95. So when I read those plays, it still did not ring a bell in me. It still did not sort of take me towards this whole 1975 uh, political atmosphere or anything like that. But it was a very deep creative experience that he had sort of expressed through certain characters. And I got more interested in the idea of mime plays, and I read a bunch of mime plays by Samuel Beckett, and then Marcel Marceau's, French experiments and all that. I started reading about that rather than getting interested in the plays itself. But then at one point, I think when I joined Outlook, or a little before that, or when I was in Hindustan Times, I thought I should read it again. And when I read it, you know, political consciousness in me had also grown because I'd been a political reporter, I had been a news editor, I was looking at news regularly, and there was this annual kind of thing that used to come and pass, the emergency, people used to speak about it. So when I read it, I think the second time, with a certain kind of experience that I had myself acquired over the years, and with this political consciousness that had developed in me, I found it very striking. I found the mime plays very striking and the form that he had chosen very striking. So I translated it. I just translated it out for just my own joy, not to publish it. And I did not show it to my father for a very long time. I think 1 or 2 years. And I just casually mentioned it to him once. And he was a very shy person. So he wouldn't demand the manuscript from me. But then he only suggested that probably I could show it to somebody and they may have, something interesting to sort of offer or comment on that or give a feedback. So that is how I showed it to Navakarnataka, the publishers Navakarnataka, because they were in that space at that time. They were, very keen to get me to write something. And then I said, I've done this. Would you be interested? And then they looked at it and they said, your father is also a friend of our organization. So why don't we publish this? And then they suggested that my brother, who was an artist, he's now in the US, of course, as a US user interface engineer and designer and all that. But then those days he used to sketch and draw and paint. So they said, why don't you both sort of collaborate? Let him draw the sketches for these plays, and you do you have anyway done the translation, so we'll publish it. So it became Phoenix and four other mime plays. In Kannada, it's called Aidu Mooka Natakagalu, but in English, I called it Phoenix and four other mime plays. And then, it was Prasanna himself wrote the blurb for the uh, back of the cover, and then we published it, and that got me a Sahitya Academy Prize. So it sort of triggered my interest further. It encouraged me to write and think of writing far more seriously, other than journalism per se. It's not that I was not serious by then. I was, but then it sort of, it was a nice little encouragement. So that is the story of the emergency thing. And then my father had collected a lot of these memoirs of written during the emergency. Those were also very interesting. I remember a book which had Sanjay Gandhi on the cover. I forget that it was a Hindi book, but my father, I was very curious because my father never read Hindi. He was not very familiar with Hindi, and my Hindi was also very kind of faltering kind of a thing. But I was very curious about that. A lot of such books were there in his collection. He had thousands of books, so that got me interested. And then, of course, with my political writing and the consciousness about the history of contemporary history of this country growing within me, I became naturally interested in this direction, and I took that kind of a thing, direction.
That's a very fascinating entry point, right? With your father's library to this.
Yeah.
But what is interesting is this is not just a story of emergency or the protests against emergency that has happened in India, and it is not a book about what led to emergency, all these questions. But it is a book about something of a cosmopolitan understanding of how Indian diaspora, who was living in the United States,
That's right.
are leading a parallel resistance against the
That's right.
emergency in India. It's a very unique story. So, how did you arrive at this particular story? What led you to write a story about this parallel history of resistance?
See, that is accidental. I should say it was very, very accidental because I am a full-time writer and a columnist. And after I stopped running newspapers, so I had to write a column every week. I used to write for multiple publications. So there is always this pressure on you to find subjects to write, right? So you're reading something and something triggers and you look up, and then you find additional information, and if you have a develop an insight over that, and then you can link up a lot of other things, then that's my method. So that's how I write. So I was looking at, for some strange reason, the archives of the New York Times. And then when I was Googling and looking at it and searching for specific information about something, then there was accidentally I was led to a page which spoke about, it was, I think, from March 1976, and it was about a full page reportage on what the Indians were doing in America to protest Indira Gandhi's dictatorship, and how a scholarship of a particular person called Anand Kumar had been cancelled, and there were protests around that, and how a bunch of people had come together to form Indians for Democracy, IFD. So that is something that I read accidentally, and that particular week, I think I wrote my column on that. It was June of 20 or 21, 20, I think. Yeah, June of 20. I wrote my column on, it was the emergency month anyway. So I wrote about how a bunch of Indians had protested against the emergency in the US. And there were couple of familiar names to me in that. One was, of course, S.R. Hiremath. He was from Karnataka. But I did not think that he was the same Hiremath who had figured in that New York Times story. So because I knew him, I had his number, and we had collaborated in the mining story against the Ballari Reddys. And so I knew him. So I just picked up the phone and asked him, "Is it the same? Are you the same Raymond?" I knew he had come back to India at some point, and I knew he had a white wife at one point, and then I knew those basic details, but I was not very sure if it was the same Hiremath. So I asked him, I mean, I just read something and it says Hiremath. And is it the same? Are you the same Hiremath? He said, of course, I mean, we all came together. I was just 30 and Anand was 25, 26 or 27. And then there was Ravi Chopra who was in New Jersey. And then, I mean, there was mention of Ravi bringing out the Indian opinion, I mean, and that was a kind of newsletter that they were bringing out, and so lots of such information. I mean, I just came to know that a lot of things had happened, and there was some literature about it. So that was the starting point. So that is where I began looking at the diaspora, taking this whole thing very seriously. But the fact that they took it seriously was not for the same reasons that people in India were taking the dictatorship seriously. These people who had top class degrees, I mean, or had top notch academic backgrounds in India, came from a certain middle class, and they had gone to America with an American dream. See, these people were looking at India's at that point of time. That was the general trend also at that time, that they thought that they have graduated from here, from IITs and top class institutions in India. They have gone to America, and they need to give back something. That give back idea was prominent, and nobody who migrated to the US, at least a lot of them in the 70s, ever thought that they will settle down there. They always had this plan to come back. There was some kind of a thing in the back of their mind that they would return. So these people were actually working on a development agenda for India. They were looking at bringing in new kinds of technology which could sort of elevate India into the next level. Also, I mean, look at rural technology, something that may not be very expensive. There were a lot of great people in India who were working on it, like Amulya Reddy at the Indian Institute of Science and others. So they were in touch with them. There's one of my protagonists called Povinder Kumar Mehta, PK Mehta, who was a professor of civil engineering at the Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley. So some of these people were very actively involved in trying to build a development trajectory for India. And their development trajectory was being built through organizations like, they had this Front for Rapid Economic Development of India, and all that. So, I mean, there were lots of such small organizations, but very active and very energetic and with a lot of ideas, because they were all IIT graduates in America who had formed a group, and they were sending back small groups of people to work during their sabbatical in certain areas. So they were not looking at buying real estate in India. They were trying to, or they were not like the diaspora today, trying to come back to India to invest in this A or B or C project, which would sort of make more money for them later. But it was a very different kind of agenda and a time. And it's not that everybody was like that. It's just this group of people that I'm speaking to you about. So FREA was one of those organizations. So, so these people thought that if the emergency, uh, you know, continues, or if this emergency, this idea of emergency is detrimental to the idea of development itself. So that was their concern. So they thought that if you don't have democracy, the very plank on which they want to develop a lot of things in India would be sort of would not have a platform at all. If an authoritarian regime wouldn't sort of be an encouraging starting point for them to come back to India and do something, or to build the like SR Hiremath and others did, build the social rural economy space, or go back to education and do something else, or like Ravi Chopra, who came back later and built the People's Science Institute in Dehradun and looked at the environment, looked at water resources, looked at rivers. And I mean, Hiremath also worked for the saving of the Tungabhadra long back ago when he came to India. And then they worked in small villages. So that was the development model. And they were inspired, obviously, by someone we really don't know, called Mahatma Gandhi. So it was someone like Mahatma Gandhi who was their inspirational figure. But then along the way, they had picked up other Western models also. Like I write quite a bit about how Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, the author of Small is Beautiful, as an economist, had inspired this IFT group, and how Hiremath, who took over the Federation of Students, bodies that represented India in the US, and called it something else, which was related to what the India League that J.J. Singh had. So he had converted the Students Federation into uh, into that. I mean, he renamed it, rechristened it, and this is all before the emergency. And then he had worked with a wonderful Bangladeshi architect called Rahman. I mean, who had built the tallest buildings in Chicago, and he had sort of inspired him to start the India Development Service (IDS). And see, this was all before the emergency, so they were all preparing to do something for India, and suddenly the emergency comes. So their whole dream, their whole development idea, their whole development trajectory is suddenly jolted and disrupted. So that is the beginning point for them. It's not a political provocation. The political provocation, of course, comes later when Anand Kumar, goes around and speaks about what the emergency, what Indira Gandhi's rule is. Because he goes around America on a lecture tour just before the emergency is declared, and then once after the emergency is declared. But he's already sort of giving you a fair idea that something very, very bad and very wrong is happening, because the JP movement is very, very active here already. And and, and Anand Kumar's family is closely associated with Jayaprakash Narayan and the socialists, the great socialists of the time. Could be Narendra Deva or Lohia. So his family in Banaras or Varanasi is very, very closely linked to, a kind of socialist idea of India. And he is familiar with the political turmoil that is taking place. He has sought explicit permission of Jayaprakash Narayan to go study and come back. And when he leaves in December of 1974, his emergency has not been clamped. But within 6 months of him reaching America, the emergency is on. And so he is trying to politically educate the diaspora on what is happening in India. Things had started deteriorating. There was a lot of anarchy. Indira Gandhi's regime was high-handed. So that he starts politically educated. So there was a political trigger that came later, but the basic thing which disturbed them was this. So so I arrived at this emergency story accidentally, to cut the whole thing short. When I was looking for something else, I see this New York Times page, and then I start connecting with people, and these people, very interestingly, had not told their story. None of them had ever mentioned that they have a part of the emergency movement. In fact, I think it was just they came back, they did their own things, and they moved on in life, and they were now all 75, 80. And I asked them if there were any papers. They said, no, we haven't preserved anything at all, except for our Anand Kumar, who had given away all his papers to the Nehru Memorial Library, which has now become the Prime Minister's library and museum. None of them had kept anything at all, except for some small little thing here and there. So, which is not exactly sufficient for you to write a book. You need much more to sort of look into and understand and basically see what their provocations are, what their interests are. So there was no material like that per se, which was handed down to me by these people, and they were also very reluctant to speak. You had to goad them; they wouldn't give you time, and then after a point of time, Hiremath took a lot of initiative at that point. He convinced his friends, but then initially they were all very reluctant. But once they opened up, they really opened up. And they started digging into their memory and telling me, no, no, this happened. Probably you should look at this. Probably you should look at that. Oh, we did something like this. Oh, we confronted this person on such and such a day in Washington. So you may get something around that date in the archives. So please do look it up. And then there were a few copies of the Indian Opinion that they had published, the newsletter that was coming out every fortnight or every month, every fortnight, sorry, in the US during the emergency. Ravi Chopra had preserved a few copies, not all the copies. So the task was quite a lot. I mean, I had to sort of look at the material first. I didn't know if I would get enough. But with some bravado, I proposed Penguin. I had just written a successful book on Deve Gowda, and Penguin was pushing me to write another book. So I just said I'll do it on the emergency. So once I had committed myself, I had to go back and look up things. So I went on a tour of the U.S. for a long tour of U.S. Started looking at different libraries, and suddenly I hit on a lot of material at one of the South Asian libraries in San Jose, and that proved very beneficial. And then there was this reluctant lady who was a participant with the IFD. I mean, she was in the IFD movement. She joined much later, after she had escaped the torture in India and reached America. Paula Bronstein. So Paula was someone who was very interesting. I had read her, I mean, a two-page note that she had written, and it was in Anand Kumar's papers that I first encountered this lady. Of course, they had mentioned that there was someone like that who was married to a person called Anadi Nayak from Orissa, who was who was put into prison as a CIA, I mean, suspected CIA asset, all that. So, but I didn't know anything. I didn't even know if she was alive. So then I started looking at American websites, Googling and seeing if there is a Paula Bronstein or a Paula Nayak. And I knew she had a daughter, and I knew the name of the daughter. Then I thought I should search through the daughter. But much before all that, I tried to get in touch with Anadi Nayak. He had been writing. He had moved out of Philadelphia. He was somewhere else. I didn't know what his status was, but he had written a short story or an article somewhere, I think in Maryland or somewhere else. So I contacted the editor of that newspaper, asking if he could part with the contacts of Anadi Nayak. Then they said there's an email, and they gave me an email. I wrote to him, but he never responded to me. I think he didn't want to go back to that phase of his life, so that was understandable. But then I didn't want to give up on that, because this Paula Bronstein story uh, seemed very fascinating to me. So I uh, I was searching, and after a few weeks, I saw this name Tapsi Naik in some list, I mean, real estate list in New York. So I just took a chance. There was an email ID. I just took a chance, and I wrote to her asking, "Are you Anadi and Paula Naik's daughter?" And she, I think, quite promptly responded saying yes. And then I asked if I could get in touch with the mother, and she asked what, why. And then I said, it is for such and such a reason, and I want to speak to your mother. And then she said, my parents have suffered quite a bit. If you ensure that they will be given reparations for all that they've gone through, then I'll put you on to my mother or something like that. I said, see, those things are not a writer can assure you about, but then I can ensure that their story is part of history. It's a story that has to be told, and therefore I am sort of very, very interested in speaking to her. So then she some good fortune on my part. I mean, she did connect me with her mother, and she was also very reluctant initially, because obviously, it's been 50 years since she was part of that, and she doesn't know who this fellow is. I'm not a world famous character. So I mean, she engaged with me for a couple of weeks, and then when she thought that I was a genuine character who really wanted to do such a thing, and then when I gave her references of her former colleagues and all that, she was convinced. And then she said, "You can come to Swarthmore to meet me." And when I went to meet her, oh, she not just spoke to me, but shared a lot of material that she had preserved from those days, which had been thrown into the attic. She had just brought it down and she had cleaned it up and she just gave everything to me. In fact, all the copies of the newsletter that these people had published, then posters, pamphlets, the other letters that she had written, lobbying for the release of her husband, all of that was in that bunch. And she had also written a diary of those days. Just to sort of a kind of cathartic thing for herself, she had to put it out of her system. So probably she had written it down. So I got one chunk of memory intact. And from that, I started reconstructing the memories of others. So it was quite an interesting kind of exercise for me to sort of, to trigger these other people, to speak, to tell them that this happened, do you remember? And then they would come back with the whole story. And then I started looking at Jethmalani's papers and Jethmalani's biography. And Jethmalani had gone and stayed there. And then I got in touch with Shrikumar Poddar, another fascinating character who had taken the whole issue of Indian emergency to the Senate in America and who was, a kind of part-time lobbyist for all the offbeat American presidential candidates. So he had quite built a built a lot of influence in America. He was very resourceful, and he was also someone who, could tell me the whole story. But when I met him in Bombay, he'd come to Bombay, and I met him in Bombay. He was not in a very good shape health wise, so he was trying to tell me more about why he went to America to date an American girl and less about the emergency experience itself. So but his wife was also part of the movement, Mayurika Poddar. She sort of filled up the gaps, and then once I got the bare outlines of that story, I knew how to tap the archives to get more information. So this is how I built the story. It started quite accidentally. With some bravado, I said I'll do a book, and then I went about interviewing people. Nothing was coming out. Then I hit upon a jackpot in the archives in San Jose. Then I went to Swarthmore. Then I went to Chicago. Then a lot of things opened up. And then here in Nehru Memorial Library, the T.N. Cowell papers, he was the India's ambassador there at that point of time. So that papers, his emergency papers, almost looked unexplored because he was such a funny character. All these speeches that he had made, he had kept a transcript. So you can't get a better kind of a gold mine of in the archives than that. So I started looking at that, and then I also wanted to make a connection to J.J. Singh because the India League that he had sort of started in the sense he had picked up from what Lala Lajpat Rai had done, and then he had sort of converted it into something in the 1940s and 50s, and had helped Indians and Asians become naturalized citizens of America with the Luce Cellar Act. So he is seen with this Harry Truman, when Harry Truman is signing the papers and has given him that pen and all that. Those pictures are there. So I thought this fellow was an interesting backdrop to the whole thing. But when I went into his papers, I was so surprised that he was a great friend of both Jayaprakash Narayan and Indira Gandhi. And he was trying to reconcile the two. Oh, that became another fascinating kind of thing for this book. So it was quite. I mean, I was lucky, I should say, Rishwant, that I ended up, stumbling upon all these things, which sort of wove the story itself for me.
I have too many questions to ask you now from what you have
Yeah,
just
please go
said.
ahead. Shoot. Yeah.
But I think I'll pick up on one strand, which is the American women who were part of the struggle, right? One is Hiremath's then wife, Mavis Sigwalt, and something that you have said about the J.J. Singh trying to reconcile between JP and Indira Gandhi. And you have mentioned in your book that how Mavis Sigwalt has raised a patriarchal question, a gendered question about the
Yes.
emergency.
Yeah.
And her question was, did the total revolution, which the JP has started, nicely covered up the tension between man and a woman at the center of it all, JP and Indira Gandhi? Would
Yes.
people have bothered so much about emergency if a male prime minister had imposed it?
That's
So,
a
yeah, yeah, that's a fantastic question. I have never thought about it. So, what do you think about this question?
no, no. I still remember that moment sitting at the dining table in Las Vegas at her home, her son's home. She had moved from New York to Las Vegas because the son had moved there, and she was just casually. This question did not come in a very deliberate fashion in the conversation. So she was not sympathetic to Indira Gandhi or anything like that, because she knew what had happened. But then she said, "This is also true." It was just a casual kind of mention about what Indira Gandhi about Indira Gandhi and the male and the gender question essentially. So, but that did something very interesting to me. So I took that question seriously. I did not probe her any further, but I went back to look at, the emergency that had been clamped before Indira Gandhi's time, which was Nehru's emergency. And Rahul Ramgundam's book was the trigger for that. And Rahul Ramgundam has written a fascinating account of George Fernandez. And in that, he had just narrated what happened to George Fernandez in the 60s, right? When the China War had happened, and how George was very, very active with the labor unions in Bombay, and how he was still picked up and he was put behind bars and for no reason, and how the Times of India had reported the whole thing at that time. And he was a patriot, perfectly in his place, whatever, doing the right things, but still was sort of put behind bars and go. That made me think that it's it made me sort of inquire a little more to and see if the characters uh, who were uh, who were resisting Nehru's emergency, or like JP himself. JP himself writes a very caustic letter to Nehru about not lifting the emergency after the war is over. And then there is Lohia, and then there is George Fernandez. Lohia dies in the 60s, mid 60s. But a lot of characters, Madhulimaye, all these people, I suddenly realized that the set of characters who had faced Nehru's emergency, or resisted or spoken against Nehru's emergency, or who had been put behind bars been picked up during Nehru's emergency, the same set of characters had been handled very badly by Indira Gandhi as well. The, so it gave me a kind of connection there. So I thought I should explain Nehru's emergency. So I wrote a bit of, I used Mavis Sigwalt's question, and then said, and then start and wrote a little about Nehru's emergency, and said it was not very different. Of course, the circumstances were different, and the whole thing was different. It was about a war, and there was an external aggression that had taken place, and this was about internal disturbance and anarchy that she said she needed to save India from. So that uh, question that you asked me, and it was a very sensitive question, asked in the most casual fashion, or remark made in the most casual fashion, which actually led to an entire, a chapter in the book, and not entirely a chapter, but then of course, quite a substantial chunk in a particular chapter. So that's interesting to see. Those are accidents of interviews, and as a journalist, you're trained to keep your eyes and ears open. And when something like that comes, you sort of innovate that into your script. It was not there in the script, and it becomes a very interesting question. And of course, the kind of abuse that Indira Gandhi still sort of gets, uh, it's a very valid question. If any male person had sort of, her own father in this case, had been so harsh, would he be measured by the same, yeah, measured by the same yardstick or the same scale? And a lot of, and JP himself, to be fair to Indira Gandhi, JP himself, I think, developed a kind of egotistic kind of thing with Indira Gandhi. So you read about she wanting to have negotiations with him, and see, they have a relationship that goes back to his wife and her father, and Gandhi and all that. So he's a veteran, and he expects Indira Gandhi to look up to him. At least that is the kind of narrative that the Congress is building. So he thinks that Indira Gandhi should look up to him like Nehru looked up to Mahatma Gandhi, or some such expectation. See, we don't know this. There is no such solid evidence to say that that is how it was in his mind. But then, if you look at a lot of narratives that were written by people around Indira Gandhi, Dhar's narrative is something that I quote. Then there is the Sugata Gupta who goes to negotiate with JP in Chandigarh, and even before that and all that. So they think that there is this ego thing between Indira Gandhi and JP, and JP is playing a different kind of a game because she's a woman. Things like that are there. It's all very sort of, it's all subterranean. It's not there on the surface, and you don't know whether if that was really the case. But then it makes a fascinating strand in the story, and to mention it doesn't make any harm because you're putting it in a very in a circumspect manner. You're not trying to say that this is how it was, because I don't write judgmental histories. I only write narrative histories. Even in the case of Deve Gowda, you must have seen, it's a narrative history. Even the Rahul Gandhi book I've written, there's a narrative kind of commentary on the times that we live in. So, I don't believe in sort of jumping to judgments, or, drawing conclusions about people very easily. So, I place the fact, it's for the reader, like sensitive readers like you, to look at it and pick it up and see if it was true or not, or explore further. So, no book is a final word, right? So, I've written something, it's not the book, it's a book, so it can be taken further. And so, any better person who writes after me may want to explore that question.
No, I think our conversation just reminds me. Maybe Ashish Nandi should write a psychoanalysis paper on JP and Indira of that time. I think that would be very interesting.
No, no, that's one of the reasons why I requested him to launch this book in Delhi at the IIC. He did launch it, but and he spoke fascinatingly that day. The jokes that were happening, taking place. Jokes that were circulating at that time, and the kind of psychological pressures that were there, and things like that. But then, see, he is not in his prime. He has grown old, and he did not speak much on this question, but probably a younger self would have given us a lot of insights about this whole thing. So, that's one of the primary reasons why I wanted a political psychologist to look at the book and speak about it. He did speak well that day, but then he didn't dwell into it quite a bit. But he spoke about fictions of the time. It was very, very nice. The kind of stories that he was telling us, and that forms another kind of narrative.
No, one more thing during emergency or even before emergency was the ghost of CIA on Indian minds.
Right.
Like that
Yeah.
everything that is happening in India is a conspiracy by the American intelligence agency to break the country. And Indira Gandhi herself accusing JP that his movement is being funded by CIA. So, were all these conspiracies, what was happening in the international scene?
No, you should remember, it was the Cold War era, and India was, kind of tilted towards the USSR. They had a great agreement, which I write about, and that raised the heckles in America. And America was, under Nixon, was trying to cultivate both Pakistan and China. So there was a lot of such kind of geopolitical pressures at the time, which in a Cold War thing, created a lot of stories. And it could be about CIA, it could be about ISI, it could be about KGB, all the intelligence agencies and counterintelligence agencies, and suspicion. Basically, the whole environment created a lot of doubt and suspicion about a lot of individuals. And JP, having studied, see, he was one of those freedom fighters who did not go to UK to study. He didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. He went to America, like Ambedkar, Columbia. Ambedkar went to Columbia. Lala Lajpat Rai went to America. This man, JP, went to America. So that's a different kind of tradition, background that we see in our freedom fighters, or people who had a socialist background and were fighting for India's cause in a completely different way. So there was that kind of a suspicion and about JP, which none of it was true, none of it is substantiated. If it was true, I think they would have dug out papers by now. But then that was the kind of, even I think even in the 50s, that kind of an accusation was being made against JP by people who were campaigning during the first general elections. Now, JP had still not given up politics at the time. It's only after that that he moves away from politics. So that kind of a accusation did exist, and it was not very. It was part of the times, right? So the Cold War era had created a lot of suspicion, a lot of doubt, and the whole uh, CIA thing. Like, when I speak about this Anadi Nayak, and Anadi Nayak being picked up as a CIA asset, and then a lot of such narratives coming about, and then even in the parliament, a lot of such questions do come up, and then there is the CPI which is swinging in a certain way. There is a CPM which is swinging in a certain way. So there is the USSR which is playing a certain game. It could be the American presidents of the time, or this person, the Secretary of State to Nixon, Henry Kissinger. People like that. In the conversations that were taking place at that time, and Indira Gandhi's own position with the American leadership, which about which I write about. Nixon's is known, the abusive thing and all that. But then Gerald Ford becomes the president. Then there is Johnson, Lyndon Johnson. There is Nixon. There is Gerald Ford, and Gerald Ford is the president during the emergency. Right. So, Gerald Ford, if YB Chavan goes to America, I write about that. And there is a kind of pressure that he tries to bring on the American Washington establishment, saying that you're allowing people to protest here. People are, doing things against Indira Gandhi, which I don't think is warranted. She's not that kind of a person and whatever. So Ford, that's the paper that I sort of, for the first time, I've written about it. It's been put out for the first time. So Ford tells YB Chavan that we judge democracy by our standards, not yours. That is the conversation that takes place between Ford and YB Chavan, who's External Affairs Minister. And YB Chavan and a set of other ministers are being sent by Indira Gandhi specially to go and speak in America. That's an exercise that she's doing because T.N. Cowell has said that the protests are getting American media attention. See, until end of 75, when she decided to postpone the general elections, the American media was not so much interested. The moment she decides to postpone the elections, then they think that she's up to something else. So then the American media starts picking up every little bit of information. So I speak about Mary McGurry writing the first big column in she's a syndicated columnist, and she's a very influential columnist. She writing about the protests for the first time, and then the others follow up, and the New York Times comes in, and others are there. So this whole question of suspicion and the CIA and all that is something that was part of the times. And India, having aligned itself so closely with the USSR for various reasons, perhaps for right reasons or wrong reasons. I'm not a geopolitical expert to be saying if it was right or wrong. Lots of people who look at it now, and there's a lot of wisdom in hindsight, which is being put out. But circumstances at the time perhaps pushed her in a certain direction. And America was not exactly friendly to India. And Indian diaspora in America did not have the influence that it has today. So it was a very small number. Less than a lakh of people. And then when J.J. Singh was doing it, it was less. It was a few thousand, a couple of thousand people. It's not what it is today, a few million. So the circumstances were different, the times were different, and also in America there was a kind of burst of democratic kind of protests and demands, and the consumer movement was picking up, the feminist movement was picking up. There was the Ralph people like Ralph Nader and others. The environmental movement had come to a certain kind of and don't forget the Watergate had taken place, where the American media had held an American president to account. So these are young people who are who are reading all this in New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and other newspapers that they're subscribing, watching PBS. I mean, I write about all that, right? See how they spend time watching. They used to work in the morning, and there would be a repeat show of the Nixon trials in the PBS at night. So Hiremath would pour a drink for himself and then watch the entire proceedings, which was being repeated. So they are inspired by a lot of things. So the world is in transition. The world is, is moving in a direction where political leaders, executive power is being held to account. And in America, and free speech is something that has guaranteed the fall, ensured the fall of an American president, all powerful American president. So, see, you know the story of all the president's men, right? So you know the story of the Washington Post, which was at it, that the other newspapers picked it up. So they were they were being exposed to a lot of radical things, democratically radical, not in any other sense. So they blend what they see there, in terms of uh, uh, social changes that are taking place, and the public sphere is becoming far more active, and they blend that with Gandhian nonviolence. And when they do that, there is also the black movement, right, which has also come to a certain kind of maturity. So they start getting help from different kinds of people, and all these people who are helping them to build this movement in America. It could be the Quakers, or it could be a bunch of senators, or it could be congressmen, or it could be pacifists, war resistors. All kinds of characters come in my book. Now, all of these people are helping them build a certain kind of movement, because not because they want to pull India down, because they've all been inspired by India and Gandhi has become a big figure after Martin Luther King Jr. has spoken about him, has made a visit to India, and he has become a big figure. But then there is the guru of Martin Luther King, who directly trains these people in America. Now, the guru of Martin Luther King, who introduced Gandhi to Martin Luther King. So there are a bunch of characters coming together who are trying to uh, do a lot of things and trying to put things together for them, and also creating a method, and why it is a non-violent pacifist kind of a thing, and they are trying to pitch at more universal ideas. These, I mean, emergency protest in India was very crude. It was about, everything was political. Everything was about, kicking Indira Gandhi out. But the protest and the resistance that is built in America and the UK, of course, they sort of tie up with the Save JP campaign in the US, in the UK, and the Gandhian influence there also is very, very clear. And there is Amnesty International, which is also sort of just, getting interested in this whole thing, and they are speaking about missing parliamentarians and people in prison and all that. They're putting out lists, and they're helping. These people are helping them collaborate. They're collaborating with them, putting out those lists. So all these things, actually, the resistance movement built in America was far more mature, far more universal, and at a very higher plane. Speaking of human rights, see, Hiremath goes on a 15-nation European tour, right, to lobby and try to create awareness. Then the Quakers coming in, Horace Alexander kind of person stepping in and doing so much more. So this is completely I mean, this part of the story was completely fascinating, which which I discovered as I wrote. I just went there to document a protest movement, but that the layers that were there hidden was something that changed the whole course of the narrative. Uh, and as I discovered those training papers, they all have a workshop to be trained as pacifist, non-violent. Because these people are absolutely new. No, now they're all 75, 80, but they were all 25, 30, 32 at that time. So they're all very, very young people who have never been into any political activity, who are not from political families, who have not sort of, known anything that could be deployed to sort of resist. So that's the whole nice part of the whole thing. Yes.
So not just workshop, they also have this reflection sessions, as you write
Yes.
about their activities, and it's just fascinating. I think back then we didn't, if we had the modern lingo, they would be called international anti-national lobby against.
Yeah, I mean, there
uh,
were there were a lot of uh, things that were being said about them, but I think it was far more interesting in the sense they were not the terminology that gets used today, the anti-national terminology, or the kind of anarchic kind of thing that gets dropped at the drop of a hat. All that did not exist. It was far more innocent kind of a thing. But then Indira Gandhi was no less harsh when she either took away the fellowship or citizenship or whatever. But if they had landed back in India, I think they would have been imprisoned. That kind of advice is given to Anand Kumar not to come back. So that is quite interesting. So they stay back, and then when they stay back, the American university system is also very generous. So they sort of support their student who's a top class student. They write reports about him, and they say that he is a top class student. If he's doing some political activity like that, our kind of university rules does not does not push him out of the system. So they try to take care of the tuition fee. They give them, space to, protest and then go and work, find small time jobs to sort of pull off this whole rash thing that has taken place, where the fellowship has been suspended, and he's spending time as a guard and at outside libraries, and he's in a real bad shape. Everything has been lost. He's lost his father. So this is about Anand Kumar. So it's a fascinating tale. It's a never-ending tale, according to me. There's so much in it. So I feel happy that I discovered those stories.
No, I think one of the interesting pictures for me among the pictures that you have documented was this women members of a New India coalition in California covering their
Yes,
faces
yes,
with
yes.
paper bags and protesting with "Long
Yeah.
Live Revolution."
Yeah, yeah. So they were all afraid of the Indian embassy and the consulate there, and they thought they would be recorded, but they still wanted to protest. And that was I think, one of the left groups, slightly left to center groups, which was involved, more radical groups. And these women in saris going out and sitting there and protesting. So I stumbled upon that picture in the San Jose archives. So it was quite a thing. So I was, because they were not they had heard of the IFD and all that, but I don't think they were connected directly. This was an independent kind of activity that was taking place. But of course, IFD became very notorious because the American press played it up. If can you believe at that time, Anand Kumar and Hiremath were on PBS for 60 minutes. On PBS 60 minutes, even they were interviewed, and they were on all the big channels, all the big radio, channels and radio programs, and they were of course in the print as well. So they got a lot of publicity at that time. So it also suited probably the American establishment to sort of fight their Cold War, and to show that your alignment with the USSR is making you more dictatorial, more Stalinist, and more Marxist and whatever. So we are part of the free world, and this is what you don't do in the free world. So lots of such messaging probably was happening at that time. Yeah.
That is very interesting. I mean, for some reason, I think it just suddenly struck me before that did an episode with Nico Slate of Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, and where she also went to US and speak with Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt, and says race is wrong. And even before Rosa Parks, she refused to move from the train. Where there's a kind of always this the kind of an how can I say it, an internationalist vision for freedom does not matter the political end of it, but
That's
in
right.
terms of
That's right. That's right.
the freedom that we're so can we take a moment and look at Indians for Democracy, the IFD, the organization. So when they were born, we know the reason they were born. They're trying to bring a kind of an they have a unique American dream, which is to develop India, right? To
Yes.
bring
Yes.
science and democracy together. What are their largest strategies apart from appearing in front of the foreign media to show the message about things that are happening in India, and the lectures too they were taking and publishing the newspaper Indian Opinion? So what are other strategies that they're using to mobilize the international pressure for the emergency to be removed in India?
See, then, except for Anand Kumar, I don't think there was anybody who was politically very aware in that group, initially at least. So, and since they were not trained political activists or did not come from any specific political background, Anand Kumar was the only one who had fought the JNU elections. He had defeated Prakash Karat and then, had become president. So, except for Anand, there was there were not too many who probably had a political kind of idea or vision. They just felt it was wrong. That is how it started. See, Indians for Democracy uh, uh, started as a kind of an informal group, right? And then it becomes a kind of formal kind of entity. So they're using the classic forms of protest, writing pamphlets, writing posters, going and protesting in front of the Indian embassy, and trying to meet the American press and trying to meet them and trying to convince them that something very big and wrong is happening in India. So initially, they don't get a very, very great response. They're just, I think people are noting things, but they're not actually jumping in or whatever. And then I mentioned this earlier that Anand had been sent on a tour. That was quite precocious. Sending Anand on a tour of important American cities. This idea is something that Poddar hits upon. See, Shrikumar Poddar, Anand has gone to Michigan to meet a friend of his who's invited him, and then he's speaking there, and Shrikumar Poddar is in the audience, and then he says he's already a millionaire there because he has sold subscriptions of American magazines and he's made a lot of money. So he has money and he has the drive, and he's also, I think, a distant relative. And he is, of course, a distant relative of Ramnath Goenka, who's running the Indian Express here, and a newspaper which was actually at the forefront of emergency protests in India. So he is there, and he sort of listens to Anand Kumar make that speech, and then he says, it can't stop at this point. If things are sort of declining so rapidly in India, in fact, he had made a prediction about which I write. He had spoken to a bunch of students in New Jersey put together by Ravi Chopra, and he had said something like an emergency may happen in India. So he was also precocious, and he was quite that was quite astute on his part. He had read the situation in India, and he had an active contact in India. So he was speaking probably. So he tried to pick on this opportunity that got created. That is the lecture of Anand Kumar, and he built on that. So he said, why not, go and tell other Indians across American states, and go to American campuses where there are lots of Indian students, and why don't you tell them what the political situation is in India, how it's deteriorating very fast, because a lot of judgments had come in, she had been unseated, a lot of things had happened, right? But still, the emergency had not been clamped. So then they raise money for Anand's lecture tour. Anand goes around, and and then since Poddar is also into publishing and all that, then the newsletter idea comes in. So that becomes part of their, again, I mean, they also do things as they go. They're not clear-headed about it at all. And they also sort of, but they're very clear that, they should not keep anybody away, but make it very clear that this is a Gandhian kind of a forum, a Gandhian slash socialist kind of a forum, but more Gandhian, because I don't think there is an agreement that the word socialist, I don't think, comes up, because they are, when they are trying to name Indians for democracy, somebody calls it a front for whatever Indian democracy. Then they say, no, the word front could uh, mean, I mean, has connotation. I mean, people may mistake it for some kind of a leftist, Marxist kind of a thing. So we shouldn't be doing that. We should stay clear from that. And they keep it as an open forum. That is the greatest achievement. So you see someone like a Mahesh Mehta, who started the VHP in America in 71, also coming to participate in their meetings. So they're not there as RSS people or VHP people. They're there to sort of see what is happening, and then they contribute. And you see a lot of other people also come in from the right to participate. And Ram Gehani is one of those whose passports gets suspended. Then there is this other person whom I write about. I mean, I met him in Washington. Um, I get again, it's slipping. The name is so he again had some experience of resisting uh, JP himself in India. He was a student, and he had some experience, but he was firmly on the right. But their commitment, when Subramaniam Swamy comes to America and tries to disrupt Indians for democracy, and tries to build his own kind of emergency resistance movement there, these people who are on the right make it very clear that their primary commitment is to IFT. So that fizzles out. That whole thing fizzles out. I mean, he does what he can, but then he tries to sort of disrupt this movement, but then it sort of stands together because there is greater commitment and there is greater kind of investment of energy in this thing. And that was again centered around his personality. So that's how these people build it. They just do it. They just build it as they go. There's no specific strategy. The only thing was, the cornerstone was Gandhian nonviolence. Then, because the Quakers come in, there is another kind of spiritual element that comes in, democracy element comes in. Then there is the black movement that comes in, so the civil rights thing comes in. Then the pacifists and war resistors come in, so it brings in a new dimension to the movement. So they build the movement as they go along. There was nothing like, they just drew a kind of plan and they followed the plan, or they wrote a manifesto and they tried to stick to it. I don't think it was such a conscious thing. So they themselves, that's perhaps why they never thought what they did was very big, because it was not a very conscious political effort. They did their thing and they moved on. And they never thought about it until I went and picked their brains. So it was something like that. So, and then at one point, though, they realized that calling it Indians for Democracy may not have a direct appeal to an American audience. So you are not operating in India, you're operating in America. And the best way to sort of bring pressure on Indira Gandhi or the Indian regime is to bring in a lot of American people into this. So, how do you convince the American audience about it? One is, of course, you have to have a far more universal name. So, they start something called the Committee for Freedom in India. And then the chairman of that is a priest. And then there are lots of people from the civil rights movement who come in. There are lots of people from the pacifist and war resistors, and all these people come in. So they try to uh, directly reach out to the American population. So that's when a second push is given to the emergency thing, because they think by the end of 75, they're not getting anywhere. So that is how they devised this Committee for Freedom in India, keep IFD, but also operate through this with a far larger, far bigger kind of set of people. And it works. It works because uh, they reach, it's the network effect. They build, it sort of, the word travels. And a lot of these people had an India story themselves because they had all been to India. People in the civil rights movement, the followers of Martin Luther King, or all these people had a kind of India story. And so Homer Jack, all these people. So they have a kind of, they know the Gandhian value system. So they get attracted by that. So see, the selling point for this whole thing in America is Gandhi and Nehru. How can Indira Gandhi, who has Gandhi's surname attached to her, she's not the same Gandhi though, do this? And how can Nehru's daughter do this? So that's the kind of trigger. And you see Kushwant Singh writing a profile of JP in New York Times. That is just before the emergency is clamped. So there's something building up there. So everything is pegged to the fact that here is a Gandhian who is trying to fight a dictatorial regime. And that dictatorial person happens to be the daughter of a finest Democrat. That is Nehru. So those two are names which are already familiar to the West. Each one of these civil rights people have their own India story, and they sort of build it up very, very interestingly. So there was no clear strategy per se, except broad principles, broad agreements. They never wanted it to go right. They never wanted to capsize to a kind of RSS agenda. So all that is very clear. But even the RSS people who came in, played a very different kind of role in this kind of setting. So they may have done their own things outside of this. That's a separate thing. But when they came into this forum, they operated on the kind of principles that these people sort of set. So that's very interesting. And RSS was also not as influential as it is today. VHP had just then been born. So they didn't have a footprint like they have today, global footprint or whatever. So they were also sort of trying to see if they could sort of join hands and whatever, and do something. So that's the story. And they also had to wash off this whole guilt or the accusation of Mahatma Gandhi's murder. So they were also trying to come out of a lot of things, and this sort of offers a kind of platform. In India, they were part of the whole thing in a very different way, at least the claims, even those contradictions I write about. In India, the level of participation and the kind of disinterest and the kind of letters that were exchanged between Indira Gandhi and the RSS leaders, all that I write about. But then still their involvement in India was of a different nature. And whatever little presence they had, the right-wing presence in America, whatever little presence they had there, they sort of blend into this larger thing and they moved on. And they also saw these people were getting the press, the media on their side.
No, that is actually very interesting. I also remember reading it in George Fernandez' biography by Rahul Ramagundam
Yeah.
about the relationship between JP, RSS, and the emergency, and how
Yes. Yes.
JP later felt betrayed by it. So that's another big story. But yeah, I think that was very interesting that you told about the legacy.
One name that I should have sort of mentioned was Bayard Rustin.
Yes.
Bayard Rustin was someone who taught Gandhian values to Martin Luther King. He is never mentioned. He was celebrated belatedly by Barack Obama. He was given the National Medal of Freedom or something, and then he became a hero of the civil rights movement. But he was a gay. So therefore, in the circumstances, he was the one who led the March on Washington when Kennedy was president. So he was a very big figure and still unknown, not as known as Martin Luther King. And he is still alive when the emergency movement is happening. And he has come to India. See, Nehru had invited him when the freedom for the first AICC session after the freedom movement. So there's a lot of history there. And he had gone to Shantiniketan because Gandhi had planned an international pacifist conference in India, which Horace Alexander was putting together. And so all that was happening, and he had come to India. He had spent time in India. So they all knew what it was, and he wrote letters to Indira Gandhi against the emergency, Bayard Rustin. So Bayard Rustin training these people to look at the protest movement, trying to tell them how they need to go about doing it, was a fascinating thing. I mean, for me, one of the big joys of having written this book was discovering Bayard Rustin. Right? I was thrilled. I didn't know who he was, but then when I read in the archival papers, his letters and his name being mentioned in workshops and all that, I just went and looked it up. And then I read a lovely biography of his. And then I realized that Netflix had made a movie on him. It was running. Yeah, it's called Rustin or something. It's very easy to look up. So, I mean, all that, educated me greatly. I should thank the process of writing the book because it sort of took me in different directions.
I think this also speaks to the fact that that we need more biographies, so we have more stories to tell. And I think fortunately that is picking up in India right now with more non-fiction writing.
Yeah, I mean that's the reason why if you read my introduction, I very clearly say I'm not trying to write this like a historian with a presumption of writing a grand history or whatever, but I'm trying to tell a nice story which has not been told. So I mean the journalistic instinct of trying to get a good story on the table is primary in this book. But of course, you are using a lot of archival material. You're blending it in. You're sort of writing through a set of dramatis personae and all that. But then the story, you never miss the focus of the story. It's written in a very dramatic way, using all these characters as they become your protagonists, and they speak and they act and they do a lot of things. So it becomes like it's almost like a film script, I mean.
As the Netflix contacted you at about.
So if you do it, I'll give you a commission. If you get them to agree to it, I'll give you a commission.
That's lovely. That's lovely. Then I'm going to work towards it now.
Yeah,
But it's a very fascinating book. And I think I think
yeah.
this should inspire people to look at the parallel movements that are happening about India across the world, and looking forward for more such stories. Thank you so much, Sugata, for this conversation.
Pleasure, pleasure. I'm really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much.